dropping some knowledge and a little love. This is the Fire on Your Head podcast with your host, Steve Bremner. Steve Bremner, missionary to Peru and blogger at stevebremner.com. The podcast where we tackle gray areas your pastor doesn't talk about. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Bremner.
Greetings, you're listening to Fire on Your Head, the podcast that's less painful than listening to a sermon on tithing. I'm Steve Bremner, and I'm your host today, and I don't know who should be more excited about this podcast today, me or you, because I got to sit down and have an interview, a conversation with Mike Breen, and some of you know who that is. Others of you have heard me refer to him or mention him numerous times on the podcast or in my blog, and he's basically the progenitor of some discipleship material and concepts that I use in the ministry we're doing here in Peru, and we value disciple multiplication. We value discipleship. We value getting people to make disciples and getting those disciples to make more disciples, and on and on and on. Not just be a group of people who congregate in the upper room but don't leave and go preach the gospel in the streets below. So this is Fire on Your Head, and I want to present to you today Mike Breen. And in the show notes, I'll link to his site, link to the things he refers to as best as I can, his material, his ministry. But for me, it's a real treat because since this man's teachings have had a huge impact on the way we're making disciples down here and the way we're teaching the Bible, using Lifeshapes and forming what we call missional communities, I asked Mike about those two things in particular because they're things that I found helpful. And so I'll leave it at that. We talk about Lifeshapes and missional community, and boom, the time runs out on those things, but we talk at length. We talk pretty deeply. So, I mean, if you've ever seen me post things on my blog about like information, imitation, and innovation, for example, I think I did a whole podcast about that a half a year ago or a year ago. You know, that came from Mike. Matrices I use on the blog, or things to do with making disciples who make disciples. And so it was a thrill for me to be able to have somebody like Mike come on the show and provide some insights and thoughts that I had never heard before, some funny, humorous stories, and I'll leave it at that. Changing gears just a little bit before I get to that, I'm working on a new book, and I'd written it. It's meant to be a follow-up to my free book on Amazon that book is called The Imperishable Seed of Christ. And my working title for the one I'm writing is called The Ever-Expanding Kingdom of God, or Christ, or, something like that, which would take it a step further and talk about multiplication and spreading. And, but I feel as though, I should hold off on that. And Brother David, if you're listening to this, your advice has had an impact on me. So I'm looking for some volunteers. If you're a new listener, or you're checking this out because Mike may have shared this on social media, or if you're a longtime listener of the the podcast, I would love to have a conference call, a Skype call, or Google Hangout for a particular person. You don't attend church anymore. You are done. You are considered one of the dones. But not only that, you've not backslidden. You're going hard after Jesus, but you don't fellowship in a weekly event on Sunday mornings. And you want to know, okay, well, like, now what? I want to have some kind of conversation with you, learn from what you're doing. It will not be recorded. It will not be a podcast. Don't worry. To help this project, it'll definitely be something at first I'll be giving away free on my website. So if that's you, get in touch with me. If you follow me on social media, send me a private message. If you have my email address, one way you can contact me is by calling my voicemail. I don't answer the calls I get on the number I'm about to give out because I get so many telemarketers and spammers and stuff like that calling it. I don't know how many people like yourself, maybe you call it to leave me a voicemail or something, or you call looking for me, but you get voicemail and hang up, don't leave a message. But if that's you, then call me at this number, 704-469-5027. That's a North Carolina area code. And make sure in that voicemail to indicate how I can reach you, how I can contact you. I'm looking for anywhere from 5 to 10 people. I think the maximum that can join a Google Hangout is 10, including myself. So that makes 9. But if I have 4 or 5 people that are willing to do this and have like a group call, then yeah, contact me and I will set this up. I will give you some time frames that are easy for me, but I'll try to accommodate the majority schedule, from people I hear from. It doesn't matter how old you are. The more variety, the better, but I suppose you don't know who else calls me. So anyway, I'm going to end that here, get on with the interview with Mike, and I hope you enjoy it. I hope you get something out of it, and I encourage you to go check out his material. Fire on your head and God bless. I guess the 2 main things I really want to start with, and I don't know which to start with, I'll let you decide how you want to answer. I would love to know how you came up with Lifeshapes, like where they came from, and I'd also love to know where you came up with, or where the idea came from of MCs, Missional Communities. So whichever of those 2 feels like the way you want to start, and I'm sure we'll
start right where you are. I mean, let's do Lifeshapes. Lifeshapes goes back a long time. I'm 57 now, and when I was 23, I went to do postgraduate studies, and my final requirements for ordination in the Church of England. I'd already got my initial requirements, which was a bachelor's degree in, religion and counselling and all that kind of stuff. But I was up in Durham, and the thing I had to do up in Durham was to do some postgraduate research. So I did all kinds of interesting things on how people think and how personalities develop. And obviously I was doing it from a Christian perspective, and so I was trying to understand how the inner workings of a person operates. So I was interested in that. I did a little bit of psychology, a bit of philosophy, a bit of various different things. And during that time of reflecting fairly deeply on those things, of course, there were some very famous books that came out at the time. One particular book that won the Pulitzer Prize that most people claim to have read, but most people haven't. It's a bit like the book I'm reading now by a man called Ian McGilchrist, called Master and His Emissary. In 20 years' time, everybody will claim that they read it, but they won't have done. But they change the way that people approach life. They change the way that people approach what a human being is. And this book, Gödel, Escher, and Bach by Gödel, Escher, and Bach by a chap called Hofstadter, was very kind of influential in forcing me to think about how people think, how they learn, how they kind of do normal stuff. And so I was coming from a fairly, I suppose, esoteric, almost abstract perspective. And around that time, the guy who at our college in Durham was teaching us pastoral care taught us what was beginning to emerge within the world of education as processes of learning. And he used a circle with a few ideas on it. Later on, educationalists and philosophers began to harden those things up. People have asked, why have I copied everybody else's stuff? And they don't realize that I didn't actually. I just, was around at a similar time that other people were coming up with their stuff. But this was about 1982. And I looked at that and I thought, you know what? I think that's how I learn. I think I learn by reflecting on what it is that's happened to me. That's what I think. That's what I think happens in my life. And so I went away and thought about that. And, I'm quite a kind of all-action kind of character. I'm always doing stuff. People imagine that means that I'm not particularly thinking. But I have this odd facility where I have a kind of a pot boiler kind of brain where, I do stuff, at the time I was playing lots of football and rugby and running around and doing all kinds of things. But I had this pot boiler that in the back of my brain that was just kind of brewing on these things. And I brewed on it for about another year and began to think about what Jesus meant by a kairos in Mark chapter 1, where there's Jesus' kind of summary statement of his preaching, which is, the time is right, the kingdom of God is at hand, repent and believe the good news. And the time is right, as we translate it into English, is the word kairos. And it's this amazing idea in Greek thinking that time can be looked at from a lot of different perspectives. You can look at chronological time, the sequential time, seconds and minutes and hours. And then you can have kairos time, which is a time that's defined by events. So you and I are having a kairos time now. I mean, you're sitting there in Lima or wherever you are in Peru, and I'm sitting here in Greenville, South Carolina. It is a weird thought, isn't it, to be thinking that, we're not looking at the clock, we're not worrying about what the sequential time is. What we're doing is we're trying to engage with the kairos of, this is a moment that God's given us, and we hope that it's of benefit to other people as we share in this time. That's a hugely kind of significant way of thinking. So I started thinking about that, and I thought, that was a selective use of a word in the New Testament. It must have reflected what it was that Jesus was saying. So I began to think about that. And so what emerged was the beginnings of the learning circle. Jesus said, the time is right, so you have this moment, this event. You look at it and you say, okay, so what am I supposed to do about that? And I asked myself, did Jesus operate with educational principles like the ones that I'd learned? In other words, did he get his students to reflect on their experience? And of course, the more I looked at the Gospels, I realized that that's what Jesus did all the time. In fact, the way that he operated was like a contemporary version of the wisdom thinkers of the Old Testament, who were always looking at the world and getting their followers and learners to understand their lives in relation to the world around them. So, the famous verse, consider the ant, and you can hear the kind of wisdom thinker saying, you need to look at the world, and as you look at the world, you get an idea of who God is. And when you understand what the world's like and what God's like, you get an idea of who you are. And then you hear Jesus saying, well, consider the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. And look at the flowers of the field. And I'm thinking, okay, so Jesus is obviously creating kairos events in these people's lives, but he's wanting them to reflect. And so that really captured my heart somehow. And so I started with that circle, and we turned it around and changed it up and did all kinds of different things with it. And the people that I was with, the way that I've always worked is that I've always worked as the, if you like, the kind of catalytic thinker, but then I've always had a community of people around me who I bounce all these ideas off. And I've no idea the degree to which they come up with stuff, but I'm conscious of the, if you like, the contribution of the discipleship community around me. And so, these were youth workers and various other things, and we bounced these ideas around them. And eventually I felt like this is the learning circle. And, a few years later, I published that in a book. So there was the first one. Funnily enough, the second one was the square. And again, it was a very similar kind of thing. I'm there, Steve, thinking about how people become disciples and how I become a disciple. And I'm talking to one of the elders of the church in Cambridge, where I'm a young pastor. They call them curates over there. And he said, well, it's very interesting what you're talking about there, because I was talking to him about the way that David Watson in his book Discipleship talked about these 4 stages of being a disciple, which are, I do it, you watch, I do it, you help, you do it, I help, you do it, I watch. Those 4 stages. And I was talking to him about it, and he said, it's very similar to to a seminar I went to. He was an IBM manager. He said, very similar to a seminar. And on the back of a bar mat, he drew out this 4-stage thing with a square. And I thought, a square? That's amazing. I've already got a circle. So maybe a square would help. Well, in a way, I think it was more for me. It may be my dyslexic brain. I don't know what it is. I just, began learning these things. Before I knew it, Sally and I were not just working amongst the kind of de-churched young people of Cambridge. Now we were working in this very alienated and very disadvantaged community in South London called Brixton. And there, of course, nobody read anything. Most people were literate, but most people were what I would call post-literate in the sense that they just never used their literacy for anything. I mean, they might read the front page of the tabloid newspaper or something like that, but they wouldn't really read anything. And so one of the things I was trying to struggle with was, these people want to follow Jesus, but they're going to have to learn some information at some point. They're going to have to learn some stuff in the Bible. They're going to have to remember how to pray. You see what I mean? And so I began using these shapes, and by then we had 3, the circle, the square, and the triangle. The triangle just came out of reflecting on who Jesus was, with my team. And a guy called Martin was particularly helpful in those days. And, we were reflecting on it. And the thing I found, Steve, that was so shocking to me was that not only did these post-literate folks enjoy using these shapes, but they found that they couldn't forget the Bible material that was connected to them. And I couldn't work this out for the life of me. We'd all been kind of challenged by the navigators who told us that you had to remember the Bible if you're ever going to be a useful Christian. But here I was getting young people to and other people, to be honest with you, I was getting people to remember the Bible almost by stealth. How the heck did they remember that it was Mark chapter 1, verse 15, the time is right, the kingdom of... how was it possible that they remembered that when, honestly, it was like pushing water up a hill with a rake, trying to get people to remember anything. And somehow the Lord revealed that. Now, of course, neuroscience, since, what was that? That was in Brixton, so that's 1987. So neuroscience has moved on since then. I'm just reading this brilliant book called The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist, as I just said, which is basically neuroscience. Neuroscience has moved on. And one of the things about neuroscience is that they've discovered that people remember things by fixing them in their neural network in their brains in shapes. And so it's not surprising, is it, that shapes are a good way for people to remember stuff. And so, that's a very, very long answer, Steve. You're probably going to have to edit it. But there you are. That's a beginning, anyway.
No, this was some good stuff that I don't remember hearing before. So
I've told anybody that stuff before. Yeah.
Well,
Nobody's ever
asked it. See, that's the thing is, over the last 4 years, I've read all of your books except for Oikonomics, mostly because our leader Mark Burgess has taught us the stuff, that the capitals and stuff. But I'm kind of a visual learner too. I see concepts or words in Scripture when I'm reading them, and so the first time I read Building a Discipling Culture, I admit it didn't really make a big impact on me. But as a writer, I'm looking at it going, this is brilliant that each chapter has like an image or a shape that corresponds with it. And then a year later, when I'd moved to where I am now in Peru, a city called Chorrillos, and I was with Mark Burgess, he started a huddle with us, his leaders, and would teach us these shapes again. And so I bought the Kindle version of the book. The year before, I borrowed his copy, and I would go through and reread a chapter to correspond with whatever he was teaching us, and it was coming alive to me in a different way. And so whenever I tell people, I recommend these things Mike Breen teaches, you should get your hands on this book or his books. I always tell them they're helpful with how to remember. It's not like the way other people write their books. That's not a jab. That's like my way of differentiating how you wrote the book. And so I've always been curious, where did he come up with these? So that's the first thing I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, well, writing of any kind is like holding my breath underwater. It's a completely unnatural thing for me. I'm a dyslexic. I read. I mean, again, this is probably neuroscience again, but I read using a different part of the brain to what you use, and so it. You know, most people don't know that I'm dyslexic, but when I'm tired and I can't bring into facility that part of the brain that I use to read, I'm terrible at reading. I mean, it's like everybody likes me reading the Bible, I think, probably because I've got an English accent. But if I'm tired of reading the Bible, you think, hang on a minute, he sounds like he's a 5-year-old. What on earth's happened? Well, of course, that's just the way. So writing and reading is just not the normal thing for me. And so writing books of any kind, it's quite an unusual thing. I love writing. I write my blog every week, and I do whatever I can to help as many people as I possibly can. But I always sit back and just think, what an incredible work of grace all of this stuff is, because it's incredible to me that God would even use these things. And to be honest with you, Steve, the initial thinking about the shapes was it's an aid memoir. It's a way of helping us remember stuff. But then, of course, it began to settle on me that something else far more significant had been stumbled upon. I mean, I cannot possibly take credit for any of this. It's entirely a work of grace. But the thing is, you see, Steve, your testimony there is a very interesting testimony, because I've literally heard that thousands of times now. And it goes like this. I thought they were a bit dorky. They were a bit, I thought, well, this seems a little bit kind of weird and programmatic. And then you start using it and you think, hang on a minute, I can remember stuff I didn't used to remember before. And then you start thinking, and somehow my huddle leader is able to analyze my life using this shape and this material. How the heck does that work? How can this thing that's been used as an aid to my memory become an analytical tool? Because that's what happens. I mean, it's an astonishing thing. It's like the idea of parables. That parables are a picture of Jesus, they're a mirror of ourselves, and then they're a window on the world. So a parable is those three things. Well, in a way, they're kind of like contemporary versions of parables, because they are a window on Jesus. All of them are about Jesus. So the triangle is up and out. That's Jesus's lifestyle. That's the way he lived. He lived upwards towards his Father, inwards towards his disciples, outwards towards the world. And then you see it as a mirror and you say, well, where am I operating right now? Am I up? Am I in? Am I out? Is there a strong part? Is there a weak part? And then you see it as a framework and you say, well, here's my small group. Here's my church. Here's the disciples that are following me. If I hold the triangle up to them, does it help them analyze that? You see what I'm saying, Steve? And I think that's the thing that's been the most astonishing part of it. And to be honest with you, I'm not even sure that I've written about that.
Yeah, I didn't know the history, the background completely to them, and I don't think you say it this way in the book when you're introducing the shapes.
No, I don't. And I mean, I wonder whether I need to write a book. I was just thinking, I was just going through my morning ablutions, brushing my teeth, doing various different things, and I was thinking to myself, maybe I just need to do something like a book called Thinking Deeply About Discipleship, and kind of pressing in to help people understand, for instance, what the connection is between story and symbol in the way that I think that discipleship operates and all of that. So anyway. Right.
Well, yeah, like once I learned these shapes, it's like you can't unlearn them or forget them or I mean, maybe someone doesn't like them and they don't use them, but I find them creeping into almost anything and everything I teach now. And has anyone ever told you they've used the Lifeshapes teaching out of the Song of Solomon?
Oh.
Yeah. Well, I don't see all of the Lifeshapes in there, but it seems like every 2 years I go through this thing where I'm spending months in the Song of Solomon teaching people down here in Peru. And the last time I did it, we spent like 6 months there, and just spontaneously using my whiteboard, I'm seeing, I did the circle, the square, up in and out, but also information, imitation, innovation in it. The way the Shulamite, the woman, she's always talking to the daughters of Jerusalem, and as it goes on, they become more interested in what she has to say. And so I found myself this particular...
You'd be able to get all 7 processes of life, both from a natural and a supernatural perspective, looking at the Song of Solomon.
Yeah, probably so.
Easily, yeah. You'd easily be able to do all of that. Yeah.
And so it was just interesting because I'd be doodling or drawing little diagrams or whatever, and then see myself like with my marker making a triangle, and it just comes to me like, that's it right there. There's how she's trying to disciple these people, make them go from watching her to joining her, going through the circle in chapter 3 and chapter 5 when
a great way of teaching the person of peace as well, Steve, to be honest, because it's both you being person of peace to others and others being people of peace to you. Like the male and female, you could teach, as it I'm sure has been taught on many occasions, you could teach relationship stuff by showing how one another can be people of peace to one another.
Right.
That's that's very good. See, that's something I've never heard. It's got my brain buzzing now, and I think to myself, praise God.
Right. Well, I'd love to spin ideas off you some more. But for time, I definitely want to explore missional communities and where those came from and what they are. Some listeners. So whenever I talk to people about what a missional community is, some people react with, "So a house church." Well, no, not necessarily. Oh, so it's just a cell group, or whatever the case is. So from the man himself, maybe you can elaborate, like where these came from, where you got the idea to call them missional communities, however you want to answer that.
Can't claim on that one. It's interesting, that one. I think that, like most things that I've learned, it comes from a kind of frustration with failure. That I think most philosophers and most spiritual teachers would say that the things that we learn most effectively come out of the frustration of failure. And so, I'm basically trying to do something that seems impossible to me. I'm trying to build a church in the inner city. I can remember saying to the Lord, as we're in there and Sally and I are struggling to get something happening in Brixton, I can remember saying to the Lord, what are you doing by even bringing us here? This is like impossible. And it was as clear as day. I felt like the Lord said to me, I'm teaching you how to build a house in a storm. And I said, why are you doing that? And he said, because one day the storm is going to be everywhere. And so I took it as a privilege then that the Lord had given me, if you like, first viewing of what was going to be happening in the rest of the Western culture, in the few years to come. And of course, I think that most sociologists would agree that the impact of the emerging culture, the postmodern, post-Christian world that we live in, started in the inner cities and started in urban areas. And so, that I wasn't thinking about that at the time, but that's basically what it was that the Lord was speaking to me about. So I just embraced it, said, okay, Lord, I don't know how to build a house in a storm. Show me what to do. And obviously you have to build a house in the same way as you do everything else. You have to get the foundations and all the materials and all of that. And I looked at what we were trying to do, and we were just using standard conventional wisdom. We had a Sunday service, and then we had small groups. And when I first arrived at the church, they basically had one small group that was a place where all of the leaders of the church met. And so basically the church met on the night of the small group and on the Sunday, and it's pretty much the same people. And so I said to them, look, guys, I think we need to kind of split up the small group so that, we give more room to people to come in and blah, blah, blah. Well, that caused a bit of a flurry, but it was all right then. And so we started these small groups, and I said, look, if it is a small group and it's a small group of the church, then we should be able to apply the triangle to it. And the small group should be able to do up in out, just like the big group does. And so they said, it's fairly naturally evident that that would be the case. I mean, it's a part of the church, and every part of the church should look like the church because they should all look like Jesus. And so I said that to everybody. Everybody agreed with it. It wasn't a big kind of hoo-ha. Nobody kind of claimed that they got better insight than that. They thought, no, that's fair enough. So I said, okay, then let's make sure then that we decide how we're going to do up, how we're going to do in, how we're going to do out. And I would prepare notes for the up part. They would usually be connected to the Sunday service or to a teaching series that I was doing on a Sunday, so that, we were weaving into the lives of people the same teaching and the same material, so that we weren't doubling up on. And it was taking the pressure off the small group leaders who had got jobs in the City of London or wherever. And so we did all of that, and it was great, actually. We spent a lot of time on that material, and I've no idea where it is now. It would have been great if I could have preserved it. I preserved most things. I don't remember preserving those, but I'm sure they're hidden in one of my red files somewhere, my famous red files. But there we were doing this, and it was very clear to me that the leaders were incredibly willing, incredibly committed, as were the groups, but they were really finding it difficult to do all three things. It was as though, we coined the phrase later, they were small enough to care, but they were not big enough to dare. And so this was about 1988, and we're looking at that, and I'm thinking, gosh, I don't know what to do about this. So we struggled on for a bit longer, and people were taking on great projects like painting old people's homes that had become dilapidated, or clearing people's yards that had become overgrown, and sharing the gospel with them, and doing real wonderful, acts of kindness that demonstrated the gospel to people. But it just was such hard work. People would turn up, and maybe there's 8 people in the small group. Well, inevitably, if there's an out, then inevitably that's the one that people kind of dodge. And so, 4 people turn up to paint the old person's flat, and, it's impossible to do. So I said to the guys, I said, look, why don't we try to kind of bring our resources together and kind of minimize our effort and maximize our effect. And at the time, the worship leader, and he did all kinds of other things, and his wife, Danny and Debbie, had a big ground floor flat in one of these old Victorian houses that you often get in these city areas. And it had a great big downstairs room. So it basically had a downstairs room and a kitchen and a bedroom. But the downstairs room was gigantic in comparison to everybody else's place. And so I said, well, how would we do this? And some said, well, I don't know how you do it, because, the children's work at small group, they do kids' work, and then they meet as a small group afterwards. But the youth work small group, they meet for their small group stuff and pray together and pray for the evening, and then they go and do youth work. And then the guys who are doing, the care and repair stuff, well, they meet at a different, I'm thinking, okay, so how do we do? So I said, well, all right then, how about we have a meal that's like, infinitely expandable. Let's have some kind of pasta meal, some spaghetti thing going. And maybe if we could have worship at certain points of the evening, and maybe at those points we could just kind of read the scriptures together, and if anybody's got a word, kind of do that, and allow people to come in and out of Danny and Debbie's flat from about 5 o'clock to 10 o'clock at night. And of course, we're all young and stupid. There are no children involved at Danny and Debbie's house. And we said, yeah, let's have a go. So we tried it. And so we did that for a few months. And what began to be obvious to me was that what was happening was something like the New Testament church. Now, the kind of brand that we'd given ourselves as a church, it was called All Saints, the church. We called ourselves the household church. And the reason for that was, the New Testament household was obviously the place where the church took place in the Bible. And, we've used the Greek word these days, oikos. In those days, you wouldn't be using oikos in the inner city, I can assure you. It sounded like somebody calling you from the other side of the street, oikos. So, that would be the way it would work. But we've got this household brand, and it was just really interesting to me that the Lord had given us this name for the church, and now we were beginning to see something like it. There's this extended family that's kind of orbiting around this location. And, I began to see the use of the gifts a little bit like the ones described in 1 Corinthians. And we began to see the meal, because the way that the meal and the communion that if we had around the meal operated was very similar to the ways that Paul described. Sometimes people would come in and eat too much, and other times people would be left with not enough food. And it's like, well, honestly, I never imagined that we'd be able to get this close to the biblical narrative. And so I think it was, I think Bob Hopkins wrote a book on church planting. I don't know when it was. I think it was about 1989, 1990 maybe. And I wrote a chapter in that about this thing. And again, I don't know where that is. It'll be around somewhere. And I talked about, how it is that we're functioning. I think that was the very first missional community model. And, according to everybody, they say that that's the first time. And, and then, of course, Sally and I were so burned out by the time we got to 1980, 1991, that we took the offer of a guy who was the pastor of one of our missionaries living in America, who said, just come and work with us. You can rest and recover. You can help us with mission. And so we went over and did a few years with them and then came back and started the work in Sheffield. And, of course, in Sheffield, we call them clusters because we clustered the small groups together, along the same lines as in Brixton. And I don't know who it was who coined them as mid-size missional communities or mid-size communities of mission. But this kind of mission-shaped church, MSC, was a report that was put together, again, using some of the staff that we had in Sheffield at the time, towards the end of the 90s and the beginning of the noughties, as we call them. And that mission-shaped church, MSC, I think that was the beginning of people thinking of mission-shaped communities and then missional communities. And so I take no credit for missional communities as a word. My way of coming up with names is use a description. So we called it a cluster because it was a clustering of small groups that now was a mid-sized group and became this thing. And it was amazing, actually. Watching it all happen in Sheffield was fascinating because although we'd started everything in Brixton and we began to see this pattern, this orbital pattern of small groups kind of coming in and out and all of that, in Brixton, in Sheffield, it was fascinating that these groups gathered. I mean, we had small groups doing kind of up and out. And then, so the way I started it was I said, look, everybody's in a small group. Let's do small groups using the 3 dimensions. And then on the fourth week in the month, let's get together as a cluster. And of course, my objective was to kind of create the meme, the viral thought that made people want to do these things. And so I was putting into them this new language of up and out, and I was putting into them this new operating kind of principle of the cluster. And of course, people came back and said, "We love this. It's great. We love the cluster thing." And I said, "We'll do more of the cluster stuff." And so they began to do that every other week, and then the cluster became the context for doing the mission. And before you know it, we've got things that are multiplying. I can remember it was, I don't know when I can remember. I can't remember the date, but I can remember the event. I can remember the kairos. I can't remember the chronos. I came back to Sally, and she was in the kitchen, and I think she was just making a cup of tea, which is the thing that English people do on almost every occasion. And she was making a cup of tea, and I said, we need to remember this, because this is the moment that what happens here in Sheffield changes the world. And she said, "What do you mean?" I said, "One of the clusters multiplied today." and became 2. And I said, it did it without pressure, without stress, and nobody is grieving over the people that they've lost, because somehow they're in a big enough group for them not to worry about the fact that they've now divided or split or multiplied or kind of created 2 groups. Now they're just carrying on. And she said, that's amazing. And I said, honestly, Sally, I think this will change the world. And I think it was probably 98. I think it was about that time, maybe 97. 90, maybe 97, yeah. And, thereby hangs the tale. So who knows how many missional communities there are worldwide. And, of course, other people, once the knowledge gets out there and the memes start running through the kind of the viral connections of people's relationships and lives, I mean, there's no way of knowing. Nobody really knows who invented radio. Was it Marconi or was it Bell? They did it on the same day, maybe.
Right.
Nobody really knows who was the first person to ride a bike, but everybody knows that within a year, everybody could ride a bike. Amazing. Roger Bannister breaks the world record for a mile, and then within a year, there's dozens of people who can do it. It's one of those things that just happens, and it may be that somebody in some far-flung place did it, and somehow it kind of communicated to me through the ether that was what was going on. I don't know, but that's the story for us anyway. Yeah,
like with regard to MCs, about a year ago, or a bit more than a year ago, my wife and I started one, and it was around that time I started reading your book on it.
You got it in Peru?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And
right.
and we're still small, but we started it, just the 2 of us, praying on Monday nights and inviting 2 other people to join us. And then I picked up your book, and it was talking about how you need like 20 people to do it. And I'm like, oops. But what started to happen is we would pray and we would draw on our board. Like I started teaching up in and out to the 2 people we invited to pray with us. And then we would, after a few weeks, start writing names of neighbors on the whiteboard and pray for them. But our rule was you have to pray for the name someone else in the room put on the board. And you can't put a name on this board of someone you're not going to actually talk to this week, that you're not going to spend some time with. And right away, in the first few months, we saw like 6 or 8 people get saved doing this. And one couple asked us to teach them the Bible, teach them how to study the Bible. And then that led to a Bible study. We've got an inductive Bible study we've been doing on Wednesday nights. And so right now we're still kind of like, I tell Mark we're like in seed form still. We have this prayer meeting and a Bible study going on. And he encourages us with things like looking for who to huddle, and maybe by the end of the year we started a huddle. We'll see, but we're basically doing a lot of what we've learned out of these books, and Mark and Anna have done a pretty good job huddling us for like the first year or 2 I've been here, and now it's just a part of my DNA, and it's a motive for why this podcast is something I've been doing for years, but it's kind of reinvigorated my motive for why I'm doing it. It's called Fire on Your Head, and it's the idea that like they left the upper room, they all had a fire on their head, they all could do it. They didn't just need to gather and have someone teach them. So that being said, I'm honored to have you on the podcast because your work has had a huge influence on what it is I'm doing down here in Peru. So, I mean, there's a buttload more questions, but I've written down a lot of notes out of this. Is there anything that takes you by surprise in particular when people get back to you and they tell you how they're implementing MCs, or is there something so crazy you're like, why didn't I think of that 20, 30 years ago when we were starting out? Anything like that's come into your mind?
Well, I tell you something kind of even more immediate than that. Sally and I have moved to this area here in Greenville, and Sally has this remarkable facility of kind of knowing how God is guiding us in terms of where we're supposed to live. I mean, I can't. It's kind of a weird thing. I much more know the what. She knows much more the where, and so generally you find out the where, and then you find out the details of the what. The big what, of course, the Great Commission is the same thing everywhere. But she found this little house that we've rented here in Greenville, and we've moved here because, the members of our oikos in Pauli's Island said that they were moving to Greenville because that's where they were sensing it. So we prayed and we said, well, maybe they were supposed to go there as well. So that's what we've done, and it's a fantastic place. But we're in this area that's been recently regenerated. It's an old African-American community. The matriarch of the community, Miss Gooch, lives 2 doors down. And the old Methodist, the old Missionary Baptist church has been torn down, and our best friends in the area live in the house that's built on that location. And there's these new houses that have been put up, and it's a beautiful area, and it's a delightful mix of different kinds of folks. And we arrived on the Wednesday, and there was such a level of peace. Sally wrote about it on my blog. My blog is disciplingculture.com. And Sally often contributes to the blog, and other people do as well. And Steve, I'd be glad for you to contribute to it sometime as well if you'd like to do that. But Sally wrote this amazing little blog on, arriving here and finding people of peace and all that kind of thing. And John and Kathy, they were amazing people of peace to us, and we were just chatting to them. We arrived on a Wednesday. It's a tiny little house, probably, I don't know. It's probably less than a quarter of the size of the house that we left in Pauli's Island. So it's a tiny little place, got 1 bedroom, one place where I am right now, which is a study, and then 1 room downstairs. And, the kind of house that most people live in. And, we're in this little area. It's a beautiful little community. We're talking to the neighbors. And I said to them, we'll do a housewarming on the Friday. Let's do a housewarming on Friday. So we did a housewarming on Friday, and we had everybody around in the neighborhood. So this is 2 days in. And everybody came, black and white, young and old, rich and poor. There aren't many rich people, to be honest, but maybe that's what you'd consider us or something. But, rich and poor. There's the guy across the street who tells us his remarkable past of living in the African-American community as a transvestite, and what that was like for him, and, his journey now and where he is with his life. And he's very open about his life and his kind of his journey in sexuality. And then there's different people who are living in the community who struggle with different things, and and they all came on the first night, and we thought, this is great. And I said to them as they were there, I said, I think we'll just do this next week, and we'll just call it happy hour. And everybody said, great. So they all came. And then the second week, people were talking about it. Honestly, I swear this is the truth. They were talking about it as if it were a feature of the community life that in some way was detached from Sally and I. And so people just started to call it happy hour. And so like this week, somebody said to me, so you're going to be there at happy hour? And I'm thinking, well, if it's not at my house, I don't know whether we've ever had happy hour, but clearly you've now owned it to the point where it's our happy hour. And Sally and I have only been here 3 months. So here we are. We've got people coming to our place on a Friday night. They pop in, have a drink. There's one couple who are Christians who don't think you should drink alcohol. And so they just, they come and they walk their dog. They kind of pretend to walk their dog. They walk their dog, and then they never walk further than our house. But it helps them to kind of feel like, well, no, we can't sit down. We've got the dog and blah, blah, blah. So that's good. And they come as well. And, we got invited by the local African-American community this last Sunday to do their reunion for the whole area, which is a big deal. And we felt very honored to be invited, and we got the T-shirt, and it was awesome. And I started to seed the idea with some of the local residents, Miss Gooch, who's a believer, and some of the other folks. I said, I'd like to do some Bible stuff on the Friday night. And again, it would be kind of discovery Bible study, a bit like you, Steve, where I'd do the narrative of Scripture and explain to them, look, when people first engaged with the Bible, it wasn't a book, it was a story. And the book was available. It's just that nobody owned it. I mean, it was, the most that was available was one in the synagogue, or, people had seen it in the synagogue, but they definitely wouldn't own one in their own home. That didn't happen for literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And so, most people pick this thing up through people reading it verbally and then explaining it, the whole midrash thing of the early New Testament period. And, I'm not going to explain all the kind of the technicalities behind it, but I'm just going to start telling the story of the Bible. I might even do it this Friday, Steve, so do pray for me. I might just kick off and do the creation story this week and say to people, this is what I'd like to do through the summer, into the fall. We'll have a fire in the backyard. We'll just gather around and do this. And we'll simply ask one another this simple question, because I'm not here to give you all the answers to life or to explain what the Bible means. I'm here to make the Bible available to you because it's something that was written for all of us. But the two questions that we ask ourselves is, what is God saying to me, and what am I going to do about it? And that for me, you see, is the beginning of a missional community. And because I've generally done missional communities from a kind of religious perspective, starting in a church and starting with a small group and all that kind of stuff, I didn't realize how easy it was to do without all of that baggage. People love hanging out. And if you find a way to hang out with people that they enjoy doing, they'll do it. And that's what we found here. People come on a Friday night. Quite a lot of them don't drink alcohol. Sally and I do. We have a glass of wine. I'll make a cocktail for people, whatever. We sit out on our porch. And people like it. They love it. It's fun. So we're going to keep doing that. And if somebody told me that however many years ago when we first started, it would have helped me a lot.
Right. Well, I'm looking at the hour and respecting your time. You already gave out the link to the disciplingculture.com, but is there any other resource or link you want to direct the listener to? Some people who listen to my show, they know I borrow a lot from your books, but is there anything you want to throw out there and let people know about?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you go to 3DM Publishing or to disciplingculture.com, you'll see the most recent things that I've written. One thing that you'll enjoy, Steve, is that I'm beginning to publish material that's been around for a long time, but we've never really shaped it into proper books, material on each of the shapes. And so we've got a book on each of the shapes now, which I think is really helping the kind of Lifeshapes ninjas like you. and then the other stuff that I'm really enjoying doing is the children's stuff at the moment. So we've got a lot of children's materials coming out. I've written a book for children. It's tremendously important to me that we keep doing that. I've got another 3 children's books that I'm going to write over the next 4 or 5 years. So,
right.
So that's just huge. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to advertise that. I don't usually do it. But, people can follow me on Twitter. I think my Facebook page is full. But if you go to the author page, the Mike Breen author page, you can follow me there. And I'd love to connect with people. Generally what I do is if people connect with me, I connect with them. If they do me the honor of connecting with me, I don't see any reason why I shouldn't. I'm not any special person.
Right.
So I'd be glad to do that.
Well, I'm glad to have you. It's like maybe 10% of the people I invite to come on actually get back to me. So to have you be in that 10 percentile is thrilling because, like I said, these materials, these life shapes, are a huge part of just my DNA or my thought process now for what I'm doing. And thank you very much. I would love to connect more about some of that Song of Solomon stuff. Because, like I said, I can only right now I don't see every single shape, but I'm sure it all comes to mind in for you, and who knows what could come out of that if you're interested. I would be thrilled if you were, and again, thank you for your time.
All right, brother. It's been great talking to you, and thanks so much, and God bless you with your work there in Peru. What an incredible inspiration you are to us, brother.
Okay, well, thank you. God bless. Have a good day.
And you too. Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed today's show. If you'd like to subscribe to the podcast, you can find us in iTunes or on Stitcher Radio, or directly at fireonyourhead.com for more options. If you want to support Steve and Lily Bremner as missionaries in Peru, or find out more about what they do, be sure to head over to their blog at stevebremner.com, or check out Steve's Kindle books on Amazon and leave reviews of the ones you liked. See you next time.